My name is Ricky. This is John. This is Alex, Quan, and Miles. We will be presenting to you guys transportation and battle strategies of the Civil War from the North versus the South. Myself, Quan, and Miles will be talking about the tactic and strategy-wise from the North and South. And John and Alex will be talking about the transportation from the North and South. So John started off.
Okay, I will be talking about the transportation of the North during the Civil War. And there were many types of transportation, but the four main ones were railroads, riverboats, horseback, and infantry marches. The railroads were the preferred method of transportation because they had 22,000 miles of track total compared to the South, which only had 9,500 miles. It was a massive, the railroads in the North were a massive advantage over the South, as explained by William. And the Civil War was the first war that incorporated railroads. Before that, they were virtually unused, and nobody thought of a good way to use the railroads other than to carry goods. The North immediately saw potential in the railroads, and that's one of the main factors to the victory. The riverboats, the North had almost 100 riverboats during the time of the Civil War. They were commissioned by civilians and private companies for the use of the military. They ran along the Mississippi and Missouri River. The horseback, it was used by Northern officials such as generals in the battlefield. They were considered the backbone of the Civil War because there were over 1 million of them used during the Civil War, and they were considered the workhorse. And infantry marches, this was basically troops carrying supplies to the conflict. And these are the pros and cons of each of the four methods of transportation. The railroads, the positives were they were used to haul infantry supplies and goods. It was by far the fastest way to transport goods on land. The top speed of the steam trains were 25 miles an hour compared to the steamboat, which was only 5 miles an hour. The downsides of the railroads, however, they were prone to accidents because since this was an earlier time, they weren't that refined, and so they would, fall off the rails. They would disintegrate, explosions, etc. Fuel problems, that was also an issue. Steam, it was fueled by coal and wood, and during the Civil War, the shipyards, they were badly understaffed, and that meant that there was a shortage of getting the wood and the coal to the train, so whenever a train would run out of wood on a route, it would have to stop, and engineers and other people working on the train would have to cut trees to fill the wood to keep the train going. Reliability was also an issue because parts were scarce, and they could not be found to fix the trains. And the track was also a problem, surprisingly, because after all the years of trade routes going along the tracks, it wore out the tracks, and the trains could not go as fast as they could. The speed dropped on average from 25 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour because of the worn out tracks. And the positives for the steamboats were they were able to move heavy cargo across water quickly. It was considered the steamboat of the water. The downsides, they were prone to sink because all of the steamboats were made of wood, and the hulls would only last about 5 years because wood would absorb all the water, and then that would lead to them sinking. Explosions were a scary factor because the boilers on the steamboat were made out of cast iron, and they would explode during any time of the journey, killing all the people on board. The resources for fuel, the steamboats, it basically depleted all the resources, all the wood and the coal. It was leaving an impact on the environment. And that's basically it for downsides. And so the upsides of the horse and mules, they were used to carry officials. wounded soldiers to the hospital from the battlefield. They were used as ambulances, and they delivered messages throughout the battlefield. They were fearless with the right type of training, so if you trained your horse right, then it would be fearless in battle, so it wouldn't, run away or run off. If there was fighting and shooting and everything, that would scare a normal animal off. The downsides to the horses and mules is that they were very high demand for the battlefield. That's why almost all of the horses were, commissioned from civilians and private owners to be used in the battlefield. And training was a big part, because training took a long time in order to train the horse well, in order to not have the horse be scared in the battlefield. And the positives of the infantry marches is that they carried small arms and soldier necessities into the battlefield. And the downsides were obstacles such as mountains, forests. This would slow them down, and it would provide difficulties for them. And the most important downside of infantry marches is fatigue, because these soldiers would march on average 40 to 60 kilometers a day, and this would make them tired, and this would, slow them down and wear them out. And I'll leave it to Alex now.
All right. Now, to elaborate on what John was talking about, the North and the South, despite using more or less the same methods of transportation, not equal in how well they used them. The North obviously had more railroad tracks than the South, as you can see on the map, and most of the infrastructure the South had in addition was built right before the start of the war, so before that it was kind of just a disconnected bunch of tracks used just by the states, not the federal government. The North also had what's called a standardized gauge for their railroads, meaning the actual rails were always roughly the same size, so pretty much any train car could run on any length of track, whereas the South didn't have that. They would have to travel any significant distance, they would often have to stop, unload everything off their train, load it onto a different train, and then keep going. The North also could effectively maintain and repair their railroads, whereas due to their lower population and dwindling economy, the South couldn't afford to keep the railroads working in the face of constant attack from the Union. And as for the use of riverboats, the South started off with a massive advantage in the form of the Mississippi River, but as a result of the Anaconda Plan, which I believe was mentioned earlier, and Ricky will be talking about in detail, the North eventually gained pretty much complete control of it on July 9th, 1863. And as for the wagon trains, the North had roughly twice as many horses, 3.4 million, to the South's 1.7 million, and in addition, the South mainly used thoroughbreds, horses bred for racing, whereas the North mostly used horses for farming and for hauling, or for carriages, so they were already used to carrying heavy loads. Thoroughbreds were defined for cavalry wagons. This was slightly balanced out by the South's high population of mules, 800,000 to the South's, to the North's 100,000. But this, for whatever reason, I couldn't find any information on why they didn't use the mules as much, but they really didn't get much use out of them. It's also worth noting that these wagon trains were considered high-value targets by both sides, since they were relatively vulnerable compared to trains and steamboats. However, because of that, both sides also independently of one another realized they would have to be heavily guarded and always made sure they were guarded from ambush. So despite both sides constantly attempting to attack the wagon trains, neither had very much success. Now on to Rick.
So I will be talking about the strategy from the North standpoint. So the North Army really had 5 major goals. By 1863, they decided to go, the 5 goals was really block out all the southern coast, control the Mississippi River, which Quan will be talking about, capture Richmond, and shatter southern civilians' morale, and use their numbers advantage. So the first one I'll be starting off with is called the Anaconda Plan. This guy, General Winfield Scott, he came up with a plan called the Anaconda Plan, which was really to send 60,000 guys, 60,000 Union troops to divide the U.S. and really to split the Mississippi River in half. The first one was to capture Richmond. Without Richmond, the South capital, and without the capital, they felt like they would be disrupted. The second one was to control the Mississippi River, and what the Mississippi River was to really block out the South connection with Europe, which Quan will be talking about. And the third one was to really use the number advantage. If you guys didn't know, the North really had more troopers than the South did. They had 2 million soldiers, and the South had 750,000 soldiers. So that's a big advantage compared to the number-wise. Go ahead, you can talk about the Mississippi River.
Okay, so my name is Quan, and I will talk about the second strategy of the Union Army, which was the Mississippi River Campaign. So during the American Civil War, controlling the river was very important. For many years, it has been used for shipping goods and commerce to the eastern side of the country, and moreover, the river held the manpower and material for the Southern Army. So, understanding the advantages of the river, the North had attempted to control it in many ways, and it was a long process with many battles. It started with the conquest of New Orleans, and then Fort Donelson, and then finally was the siege of Vicksburg. And I will concentrate on this battle because it was one of the most important fights of the Civil War. So, by the middle of 1862, the city of Vicksburg was the only stronghold left for the Confederacy, and the victory of Vicksburg would help the North regain control of the lower part of the river, split the South in half, and more importantly, they would cut off Richmond from the western half of the Confederacy. And the campaign can be best understood when divided in 4 parts. First of all was the upriver attack by the Union gunboats in the spring of 1862. And then came with a full campaign of General Grant, which included the invasion of the northern Mississippi. And the third part was the campaign of diversion, and the final part was the siege. And as you can see here is a map of the campaign of Vicksburg. The blue line here is the marching line of the Union, and the red dot over here, the Confederate defense base. So the first attempt to take the city failed in the winter of 1862. However, General Grant renewed his effort right in the spring of 1863. So on the last day of April, his army moved from Louisiana to here. And on the very next day, he won the battle of Port Gibson. And then quickly he moved toward the Mississippi Railroad system that we over here. And from May 12 to May 17, he won the Battle of Raymond. He captured Jackson, and he defeated General Pendleton's main army at Champion Hill and Big Black River. And Pemberton retreated back to Vicksburg, and Rand decided to attack the city right after that. And in just 3 weeks, the Union Army marched for 180 miles. They won another 5 battles, and they captured around 6,000 prisoners. And finally, the Confederates surrendered on the 4th of July, and the campaign was considered as one of the most brilliant in the Civil War. So in conclusion, with the loss of Vicksburg and the Union victory at Port Hudson 5 days later, well, the North controlled the whole entire Mississippi, and they effectively split the South in half. And it's my strategy.
So, to talk about the South, their techniques were far different than the North. The first one was all they had to do was survive. Unlike the North, they just had to stay where they were. All they wanted to do was secede from America. So they didn't have to attack anyone, they just had to outlast the North, man-wise, food-wise, and whatnot, until the North just kind of gave up. The second one they had to worry about is they had to dig deep due to the attack from the North. Now their main strategy was to build forts. They were going to dig trenches, they were going to build walls to make it so the North could not get in. However, this particular plan backfired on them. Sun Tzu said that it takes twice as many men to attack than it does to defend. Well, unfortunately for the South, the North had those numbers. The North completely outnumbered the South, so they were completely willing to spend twice as many men to attack the South. Now the third thing that the South wanted to do was starve the North of British goods. To do this, they said, hey Britain, we are going to stop the cotton trade with you, and unless you help us defeat the North, we are not going to give it back. Well, to that Britain said, fine, we're not going to get involved. Instead, we are going to get our cotton from India. So that plan completely backfired on them. And not only did they lose their trade with Britain, but Britain just stopped trading with the South. So no longer could they get their metal and their food from Britain. Next, surviving attacks wasn't good enough. South didn't want the North to decide every battle. They knew that if they wanted to win this war, they would eventually have to attack the North as well. But when it came to attacking, they had a slight advantage. It was on their land. Now the North was going into the South with either outdated maps or no maps at all. This meant that they were charting as they went on, whereas the South, they had maps. They knew where they were going, and they knew where the North were likely to be. This led to them using a lot of guerrilla warfare, a lot of hit and runs on small northern encampments that would weaken the North quite significantly. Well, that was their plan at least. I mean, hitting small encampments for an army that has almost 3 to 4 times as many people as you, it's not going to cause a lot. And what they did end up getting, they were easily able to regain through the fast train system that they had in the North. Now, one major battle that was very significant to the South and North, tactical-wise, was a battle that went like so. See, the South wanted to attack the northern encampment. Now, this raid by Stonewall Jackson was very significant because it was the first attack that the South made that went into the night. See, usually, as we saw in the movie, Cold Mountain, the North and South kept store hours when it came to attacking. So they would attack during the day, regroup during the night, get ammo, help the wounded, and whatnot, and attack back in the morning. Well, this particular night, there was a full moon coming up. So Stonewall Jackson decided they were going to use that light to go around to the side and attack this direction. With the light, they were able to get around, and the North wouldn't be able to see them. However, one major problem with this was they didn't stop attacking from this side. And what ended up happening was crossfire. Stonewall Jackson ended up getting shot in the left arm by his own men. This promptly ended the attack, and they retreated. Stonewall Jackson did not die from this wound, however, he would later die due to infections of it. And Ulysses S. Grant said, when Stonewall Jackson lost his left arm, I lost my right arm man. And losing Stonewall Jackson as a tactician was a major defeat for the South. One of the main things that led to their inevitable loss. Now, in case you were off somewhere else, let's kind of regroup and see where everything was. See, the North, not only did they have superior numbers, but they had transportation on their side. The North were able to use their tracks to get almost anywhere. They were all the same size, so any train could go on any track, which saved them a ton of time. Unlike the South, they didn't have to unload cargo from each train onto another one, which could take hours to days. So getting equipment to their soldiers was way faster. Not only that, but with the Anaconda Plan, the North were able to section off the South, starving them of any goods. However, it's not like they needed help with that, since the South had decided to not trade with Britain anymore, starving them from their own goods anyway. Not only that, but the boats had a slight advantage for the South in the beginning. However, with the Mississippi taken over by the North later on in the war, they lost that battle as well. They did have a slight advantage when it came to horses, tactical military-wise, as their horses were bred for racing, which meant they were fast, they knew what they were doing, which was really good for cavalry. Unfortunately, attacking wasn't their strong suit. I mean, kind of, but as you can see, their tactics weren't always the best. Whereas the North had their horses mainly for getting cargo, sick people, food, all that to their soldiers. Well, not the sick to their soldiers, but out of there. So all in all, the North, pretty much in every case, knew what they were doing. They had the men, they had the supplies, they had the strategy, everything they needed to win a war. And all the South had was a general hope that they could win, which inevitably was destroyed. And that is what led to the loss of the South in the Civil War and the win of the North.